Hey guys, it's Courtney and welcome to the first stop of my 10,000 subscriber hop. Along this hop, you will find 10 videos with 10 giveaways. So be sure to check them out. All the information will be linked in the description box below. So the more you comment, the better chance you have to win. So today I'm going to be creating 4 very simple cards using some ink blending and masking techniques. I'm going to be using the Grateful stamp set as well as the Thankful die set by Honeybee Stamps, and the Thankful die set will be the giveaway on this channel. So all you have to do is comment below and I will be picking a random winner. So for my first card here, I am using some Simon Says stamp masking paper. I am cutting 2 or 3 strips maybe, of 1/4 inch wide, and the others are 1/2 inch wide. And I'm going to use my grid mat here. This is a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and it's cut down to 5.5 by 4 1/4. And I'm just lining up the corners on my work surface here, and this is just going to kind of guide me as far as placing down my masks because I can't ever lay anything straight or line anything up correctly. And I'm just going to alternate. So it'll be one of the skinny strips and then one of the thicker strips. So it'll be the 1/4 inch, then the 1/2 inch, then the 1/4 inch. And I kind of go back and forth until I reach the other corner of the card panel. So I'm pretty much filling up the entire panel for this one. And I'm just using those lines on my grid mat to make sure that they're completely straight. So as long as they line up on both ends, I'm fine. Now I have a little bit hanging off, and I'm doing that on purpose. This keeps my panel in place when I do my ink blending. It just is what works best for me. Whatever works best for you, by all means. So once I finished up placing down all of the masks, then we can move on to the ink blending. And I'm going to be using Distress Oxides for all of these cards. So for my first combination here, I'm going to be using some oranges and yellows. And I am going to start my blending off to the right hand side with the Squeeze Lemonade. And I'm not putting a ton of color down here. I'm pretty much just laying down some color until I reach the other end, and then I'll work in the opposite direction. And I typically do this when I'm ink blending an entire background. I seem to get a better blend if I go over it twice. So I moved on to the Wild Honey, then the Carved Pumpkin, then the Abandoned Coral, and then I'm going to add more of the Carved Pumpkin, Wild Honey, and the Squeezed Lemonade at the end. And this is where I'll start working in reverse. And this is when I'm actually concerned with the colors blending. The first time around, I'm pretty much just laying down the color, getting my placement right, and getting the paper saturated a little bit. The more the paper is saturated, the better your inks are going to blend. So I find it easy to go over it, kind of go back and forth as many times as you need to. Keep in mind the Distress Oxides kind of lay on top of the paper instead of sinking into the paper right away. So you have a lot more time to work with them. But also once you add a certain amount of ink, there's no more adding anymore. So finishing off with that Squeeze Lemonade on the right hand side, and I am going to add a little bit of shimmer spray and soak that up with a paper towel. Now, if you guys have watched my videos before, you know that about a month or so ago, I had a little bit of a disaster with my shimmer spray, and it's never been quite the same, but for this purpose, I guess it works. I guess it works okay. So before I remove my masks, I'm going to put this aside to dry. You do want to make sure that your panel has some time to dry before removing your masks because they can tear the paper. So for the next card, I am going to cut 2 strips, 1/4 inch wide. So these are the skinny little strips. And again, using another piece of the Neenah Solar White. And this time I am going to place these on the top and bottom, but still leaving a little bit of space on the top and the bottom. And I'm going to bring out some Post-it note tape. Now, I am using the Simon Says stamp masking paper. It is by far my favorite masking paper. I stock up on it. I very rarely am able to place orders, but when I do, I get like 3 or 4 packs of this because I never, ever, ever want to run out. But I also love using Post-it note tape because it's cheaper and I don't feel like I'm wasting my masking paper. So I'm also going to take 2 pieces of Post-it note tape and I'm just going to line that up with the top and the bottom of my card panel. So you're going to see that I have a little bit of a gap between the Post-it note tape and the actual masking paper. And it's kind of fun to play with different patterns because you're never really sure how it's going to come out until you remove the masks, which you'll see in just a few minutes. So again, I have a little bit of this hanging off the card panel, just kind of makes it a little bit easier, makes the card panel stick in place while I do my ink blending. So for this one, I am going to start my blending in the top left-hand corner and work my way down to the right-hand lower corner. And I am going to start off with the picked raspberry, moved on to the seedless preserves, dusty concord, and peacock feathers, and then again worked in the opposite direction. So once I had that peacock feathers down, I added a little bit more of the dusty concord and the seedless preserves and moved in the opposite direction back up to that upper left-hand corner to make sure that these colors blended nicely together. Sometimes you don't even need to add any more ink to your ink blending tool or your blending brush. You can kind of just use what's on there or just use the plain brush itself to move those inks around a little bit to get those to blend, because like I said, they sit on top of the paper, so it gives you plenty of time to get your colors worked and blended nicely. So again, for this one, I am going to add a little bit of that shimmer spray with that nozzle and soak that up with a paper towel and put this aside to dry. For the third panel, I'm going to cut, again, just 2 1/4-inch strips of that masking paper and taking another piece of the Nina Solar White. And this one is going to be really simple masking because I'm just going to put it on the top and bottom of the landscape card. So this will be a different orientation, but just going to put that on the top and bottom, pretty much very similar to the way I did with the second card panel, but this time we're going to do the actual ink blending a little bit different. The previous 2 cards I kind of worked in order from top to bottom or from corner to corner or from side to side, but this one I am going to kind of just place down my color as I go. So I am starting with cracked pistachio, and I am just going to kind of blob this down wherever I want to. And then I'm going to add a little bit of the evergreen bow or evergreen bow, bow. I think it's bow. And then I'm going to add some peacock feathers and finish off with the broken china. Now you'll see that I don't necessarily get the greatest blend in all of the areas, but being, like I said, this sits on top of the paper, I can go back in with that brush, sometimes adding a little bit more ink, sometimes not, and getting these colors to blend a little bit. Now, since I started card making, I've always been told to work in 3s, the visual triangle. So that's kind of how I started with that cracked pistachio, but in the end, all of these colors kind of mush and mash together that it really didn't make too much of a difference. But like I said, just finishing off, making sure that these colors blend at least somewhat. And then once again, finishing off with that shimmer spray, dabbing that with a paper towel and setting that aside to dry. Now, for the fourth and final panel that we're going to be working on, we're still going to be doing some masking and we're still obviously going to be doing some ink blending, but this time we're going to add 2 layers of ink. So I have a piece of the Nina Solar White, and this is just plain. I haven't done any masking to it, and I am going to be using spun sugar, shaded lilac, and tumbled glass. Had a brain freeze there. So I am going to work from top to bottom just because it's the easiest. And I'm using a blending brush. You can certainly use a regular ink blending tool for this, but I find that I have better luck building up color with a blending brush. These are the Blending Buddy brushes by Trinity Stamps. There's a ton of different blending brushes on the market, and these are pretty much the only ones I use because I don't feel the need to buy anymore. So I've never tried the makeup brushes from Amazon or Walmart or whatever, and I've never tried any other brand. I'm sure they're pretty comparable. From what I've heard, they're pretty comparable, but I was very fortunate enough to be on the Trinity Stamps design team for a long time, and I just love these brushes, and I love that they're flat on the bottom, so when I do wash them out, I can kind of just line them up to dry, and I don't have to worry about the bristles being kind of frayed. Plus, they come with a little top. But anyway, so it's best to use a blending brush if you want to slowly build up the color, because you can see that I'm using a very, very light hand and the colors are very, very, very light. Kind of reminds me of cotton candy. So once I finished off with that tumbled glass, you can see that my colors are very, very light. I am going to go ahead and cut down some strips of the masking paper once again. And I'm only going to do 2 little strips of masking paper, top and bottom, very similar to the ones that we've done previously. But the main thing you want to think about or make sure is that your panel is at least somewhat dry. Even though we didn't add a ton of ink, we still added ink. And we added a very slow drying ink. So things don't like to stick to it when it's still wet. And even though I'm telling you to wait till the panel is dry, I didn't necessarily do that. And I did have a little bit of trouble having my masks stick down and stay in place. They stuck down, but as soon as I tried to move the paper, they were kind of shifting all over. I added a ton of pressure with just my finger, kind of rubbed my finger over it several times. And I did allow it, or it stuck somewhat. It's stuck enough to continue on with my ink blending anyway, but definitely recommend you give it, 3-4 minutes before you try to add your masks. So going back in with the second layer of ink, and I'm going to use the same colors. You can certainly use darker colors that kind of coordinate with the lighter ones, but I just decided to use the same 3 ink pads and just go over the same areas that I've already laid out. But this time I'm going in with a much heavier hand, and these are light colors anyway, but I'm just going to get a little bit more of an intense look. Now I am sort of kind of worried about these blending, but for the most part, these masks kind of break it up so that your blending doesn't actually have to be perfect. So because I do already have kind of like a base layer down of this ink, I'm only working from top to bottom. I'm not going to work my way back up because they're already sort of kind of blending already. So again, just going in that order of the spun sugar, the shaded lilac, I keep forgetting the name of that one, tumbled glass, then the shaded lilac, then the spun sugar again. I'm really drawing a blank today. So again, use some shimmer powder on this panel and put that aside to dry. So now that my panels have dried, because we've added a whole lot of moisture, not just with the ink, but remember we added the spatters, and this will soak right through your paper masks. So give it at least a half an hour to dry. So now we can go ahead and remove all the masks and kind of see the patterns that we created. So starting off with this first one with these diagonal stripes, I'm carefully removing the masks. You'll see that, I have this sped up a little bit, but you'll see that when I start peeling it back, I'm kind of laying the mask right along the panel so that if it does start to tear, I can kind of prevent it from tearing my paper itself. So we have a really interesting design here, and I think it's nice and colorful, and you can see that it looks like I got a perfect blend, even though I probably didn't. So for the next one here, this is the one that we use the Post-it note tape on the top. Again, just being very careful to remove my masks, and you can see that we have a nice center focal point with our ink blending. Kind of looks like a galaxy background a little bit. So next one is this kind of blobby one, and we just have these 2 simple masks, but we have that center focal point again. Last one, this is the double layer of ink here, and you can see that we just have a little bit of a subtle masking here because that ink is kind of showing through. So now let's make these into cards. So for this first one here, I went ahead and cut the thankful word as well as just one of the shadows. The die set comes with 2 shadows. And I am going to use my Copic markers to color in my word. You can use any coloring medium you want. However, I'm going to be using the crystal glaze on top of my word, which is kind of like a glossy accent, and it's water-ish, I guess, and that was going to react with Distress Oxide ink. So I didn't want to do any ink blending. I figured the markers are going to be permanent and they're not going to bleed once I add that moisture to it. So I just picked out a bunch of colors that closely match the ink that I used. I'm adding one red in there just to kind of, it's an R35. It's more of a coral look, so it kind of matches that abandoned coral. And then I'm going right down to a Y08, which is a really bright yellow, very similar to the squeezed lemonade. So I'm just kind of going back and forth, same way as I did my ink blending, really. Again, not too concerned with them being perfectly blended. This is a skinny little word die. Nobody's ever going to make sure that you have blended perfectly. So once that was all blended, I can go ahead and adhere that down to the shadow piece, which is cut with some white cardstock. Now you can use double-sided adhesive here before you run it through your die cutting machine, but I prefer to use wet glue because it gives me some time to move things around. Like I said before, I can never line things up right the first time. So the wet glue does allow me some time to get it right. I just add little dots here and there. I really don't even squeeze the bottle. I just kind of dot it as it kind of flows out on its own. Line that up onto that shadow, and then I will adhere that entire thing down onto my card panel. I didn't bother to cut this card panel down. I'm not using any dies except for the Thankful die in this entire video. I kept everything nice and simple. You need minimal supplies to create cards. You do not need every fancy schmancy thing that's out there. So these are very, very simple. So I'm taking 2 of the sentiments from the Grateful stamp set and line those up onto my grid mat to make sure that they were nice and straight. Stamp that down with the carved pumpkin ink just to make sure it matches my background onto some white cardstock. Cut that down into a skinny strip, and on one end, I just cut that down at an angle, added some foam tape, and popped that up directly underneath my word die. Now, like I said, I'm going to be adding some Nouveau Crystal Glaze to just the word. Now, I prefer glossy accents, and that's all personal preference. Glossy accents is very similar to the Crystal Glaze, but I find that the Crystal Glaze is a little bit thinner and kind of like watery, where it kind of drips off the letters a little bit more, where the glossy accents, it pretty much only stays where you put it, which I like a lot better. But I like to add glossy accents to my word dies. It just adds a little bit of shine and it really makes them stick out. So you'll see that I'm just going to outline the word, and some of those areas definitely did kind of drip off the letters. But in order to fix that, I just take my craft knife and kind of just scoop it up. Scoop it up, place it where it needs to go, or just scoop it up and usually rub it on my finger, which is why my fingers got all gross by the time I finish a card. But that is it. That is the first card. Moving on to the second card here, I cut the word die with the black cardstock and the outline or the shadow with white cardstock. And once again, use my Tombow Mono multi-glue to just dot that along the back of the word, line that up on the outline or the shadow, whatever you want to call it. So I want the black to really stand out. So there's a couple of ways that I'm going to incorporate that into the card. So first, I went ahead and trimmed down my panel a little bit by 1/4 of an inch. So I took 1/4 of an inch off of one side, and I took 1/8 of an inch off the top and bottom because I still want my ink blended area to be centered like we did with the masking. Then I'm going to cut a piece of black cardstock that is just a little bit larger than my card panel, just a little bit smaller than my card base. That way I have a nice black outline and a nice white outline, and this will really make everything pop. So I'm going to adhere my panel down to the black and then the black onto my A2 size note card there. And then I can add my outlines of the ink blended areas, I'll call them. So I'm going to bring out my T-square ruler, and I use the EK Success journaling pen, but you can use pretty much any pen here. I wouldn't recommend a Copic, probably something that is not going to damage if you go over the distress oxides. And all I'm doing is lining up the edges of each of the little areas that we have the ink blending, just to kind of frame them in, and this will really make it pop off the page as well. So I can adhere my word die right there in the center, and I didn't bother to add anything else to the sentiment. I just kind of kept this as is. However, I did add that crystal glaze. And for this one, I really had an issue with the crystal glaze running off the paper. I don't know what the difference was. It's the same die, and it's just black cardstock versus white cardstock, but there was a lot of different areas that I did have to touch up, and every time I touched them up, it seemed to just plop back down onto areas it shouldn't be. So I did have to go back and forth several times, but finally got it to look decent. And I do have a little bit of an ink smudge down on the bottom white area. So in order to kind of mask that, I should say, I'm just going to use some enamel accents by Ranger, and this is the black, and I'm just going to add a few of those to kind of just cover up those ink smudges there. if you can't erase them, cover them up. So that is it for card number 2. Moving on to the third one. This is the blobby one that we kind of just added color wherever we wanted to. I am going to go ahead and cut just the word. So just the thankful word, no shadow for this one, from white cardstock. And this is going to be, remember, this is going to be a landscape card. So because this is a thinner die, it's just the word, it's thinner, I can kind of manipulate it a little bit, and I'm going to curve it. So I'm going to do the same thing with my wet glue. Definitely recommend you using wet glue for this one. Just dab a little bit on the back of that, and then I'm just going to curve that onto my card panel. Now, I got a nice curve. I have to say that the curve is pretty even, but it was way off to one side of the card panel. So that didn't look too good. So I ended up having to cut down my card panel just a little bit. I think I cut 1/4 of an inch off the one side. And again, just 1/8 of an inch off the top, 1/8 of an inch off the bottom to make sure that everything still remains centered. Adhered that to a white card base. And that way I have just a little bit of a white border. It really makes everything pop even more. And for the rest of the sentiment, I'm going to use the same 2 words as I used for card number 1, but this time I am stamping out with the peacock feathers, which is one of the distress inks or distress oxides that we used in the background, and that will really make it pop. And cut that down with my tonic trimmer and pop that up with some foam tape directly below the word. Now, I didn't add any glossy accents or crystal glaze to this one because I know that it seeps off of it, and I didn't want it hitting that distress oxide because we would have had a very big muddy mess. So that is it for card number 3. Moving on to the 4th and final card, I went ahead and die cut the word as well as the shadow, both with white cardstock. And in order to kind of make the word pop out from the shadow, I'm going to add a whole lot of shimmer. I'm taking a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen and I'm going over the entire word and I'm soaking it. I'm really soaking it to make it really nice and shimmery. But keep in mind that this is not watercolor paper. This is just Nina Solar White, and I've added a whole lot of moisture. So I am going to put that aside to dry for a few minutes. I cut this panel down same way as I did before, take off a little bit on the side and the same amount on the top and the bottom to make sure that everything is nice and even. Adhered that to my white A2 size card base. That way I have just a tiny bit of a white border showing. Now for the remaining part of the sentiment, I'm going to use 2 different sentiments from the Grateful Stamp set. Again, line that up onto my grid mat to make sure that they were perfectly straight. Pop those onto my acrylic block, and this time I'm stamping with that shaded lilac onto some white cardstock. Once again, cut that down with my tonic trimmer, one side to an angle, the other side straight, and then I can adhere everything together. Adhere that word to the shadow piece, and you'll see, it's kind of hard to see on camera, but in real life, it does give you a tone-on-tone look, but that shimmer is, wow, it is shimmery. So I popped up the sentiment directly, or the remaining part of the sentiment directly above that with some foam tape. And I had some ink smudges on this one too. And that's what happens when you're doing a whole lot of ink blending and you don't wash your hands in between. You tend to get some ink smudges. So I just took some Nuvo drops. These are just the White Blizzard. They just have a little bit of sparkle, and added that. And it will kind of blend in with the background with that shimmer spray. So that is it for card number 4. Here's a quick look at all four cards that we created today. As always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below, as well as all of the information for the hat. Make sure that you check out all 10 stops. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and thank you for 10K. Have a great day. Bye.